Hello and welcome back to the Elements of Deep Sea Mining. I'm Eric Young. Today I'm sharing a recording of a live debate that was hosted by Impossible Metals on the 21st of November. The debate brings together two opposing voices in the deep sea mining conversation. Oliver Gunasekra, CEO of Impossible Metals, making the technology forward case for developing this industry, and Victor Vescovo, explorer and investor, offering a strongly skeptical view that the technology and the economics are going to be able to sustain and justify the environmental risks. If you follow this space, you know how rare it is to get a focused, structured, and civil exchange, and I appreciated the constructive discussion. After the debate, both Oliver and Victor agreed to stick around for a short conversation on how we can move the deep sea mining discussion forward without avoiding controversy or flattening the real disagreements, and that conversation is released in a separate episode. With that, let's jump straight into the debate. I bring you my discussion with Oliver Gunasekra and Victor Vescovo. Our motion today is responsible seabed resource collection is essential to meeting the world's growing need for metals. So this question sits at the crossroads between the energy transition, environmental impacts, technology development, and global supply chains. So rather than take this motion as one large debate, we've decided to split the debate today into 5 topics relating to different aspects of the motion. So I'll just introduce the format. We're going to do brief introductions to Oliver and Victor. Then we'll have 10 minutes per topic for each of the 5 topics, during which each debater will have 2 minutes to make their case, followed by 1 minute each for rebuttals. And then we'll have 3 minutes of open discussion. The audience questions will take place after the debate. So if you want to ask a question during that time, please use the hand raise icon, and Holly will call on you to unmute yourself and ask your question. You can also put questions into the chat today, but I'm not sure that we will get to those questions given how many of us there are here. Please also remember to keep your mic turned off until Holly calls on you for the question. A quick note on the scope of the debate today. Our focus is going to be on nodules, and I think we're going to assume that everybody here has some amount of prior knowledge of deep sea mining for nodules. So I'm going to ask the debaters to minimize background explanations. Obviously, there's a balance here. The aim is to make this useful to people who are already aware of the topic and are looking for information and arguments to help inform their views. If by chance anybody in the audience is coming to this debate with prior views about deep sea mining, I'm going to ask everyone to please hold your prior views lightly and with curiosity so that you get the most out of this. That having been said, we'll move on to the intros. So Oliver and Victor, I'm going to invite each of you to take 2 minutes to explain why this issue matters to you and what brought you to the deep sea mining topic. You both have long track records of success in various different arenas, and I think it's reasonable for the audience to ask why you're choosing to spend your time on this topic right now. Also, in the spirit of transparency, please say whether you believe you have any financial or other conflict of interest in this discussion, including whether you hold investment stakes in any firms connected to the debate topic. With that, by coin toss, Oliver, we are going to start with you. Please take 2 minutes to introduce yourself.
Okay. Thank you, Eric, and thank you, Victor, for also participating. So I'm a 3-time serial entrepreneur and founder. I founded 3 successful American companies in semiconductors and now mineral technology. I founded Impossible Metals because I recognized that critical metals have the same strategic importance as coal in the 19th century, oil in the 20th. They're an essential resource that will determine America's prosperity, security, and leadership for this coming century. Because I live in California, I also had the direct impact of the wildfires in 2020. The sky actually went orange. And that was a real motivation for me to actually found another company to try and help us decarbonize. At the same time, I see urgent needs for physical AI and robotics have reached the point where, it's getting really, really difficult to get all of the metals that we need. The traditional approach to mining is becoming unsustainable. It has a massive impact on the environment, on people, and we can now use physical AI and robotics to vastly affect the way that we actually harvest these critical minerals. The minerals available in the deep sea, copper, nickel, cobalt, and manganese, are really vital for Americans' national defense. And I think you cannot separate one from the other. All four of these metals are really, really critical and essential. And when you look at the—
Oliver, sorry, there's only 15 seconds left. I just also want you to get to this issue of financial conflict of interests.
Yeah, so I am a founder and a majority, a significant shareholder in metals. In my view, seabed minerals offers 5 major advantages: outstanding economics, especially due to the high grade, independence from adversary control like China, lower social and environmental consequences, speed to extract, and size of the resource. Finished. Looking forward to discussing this.
Okay, Oliver, that was a bit over 2 minutes. Victor, I won't be too rigid with you on the 2-minute timer here. Please take 2 minutes and tell us why you're here today.
Sure. I'm Victor Vescovo. I'm a private equity investor as well as venture capitalist for the last 25 years. I've been invested and helped operate over 50 industrial type companies as well as VCs. I came to the ocean as an explorer in the last 10 years. I've owned and operated a deep submersible that operated at the ultimate depths of 11,000 meters, but often in depths of 4,000 to 6,000 meters. I did that personally. I helped maintain the submersible. I paid all of its bills for maintenance, so I'm familiar with the operations of heavy 12-ton equipment in the open ocean personally. I am involved in this debate because, unlike other venture capital investments, I think that this one, while I admire the desire to advance technology and help the world as I do in my own venture capital investments, I think that this one has what we call an externality. It would damage the seafloor in the process of trying to mine these nodules. And because of that, I think there's a higher burden of proof that it would actually work and that it would be economically viable, which I do not believe that it will be. But that in the process of discovering that it would not be economically sustainable, that it would damage tens of thousands of square kilometers of virgin seafloor that we do not quite yet understand. In terms of my potential conflicts of interest, I have no direct involvement in deep sea mining on the long or the short basis, as we say in finance, unlike Oliver. I do have a less than 2% investment in a company called Astroforge, which is trying to mine asteroids. But I think that's a very false comparison because the metals we would be seeking in asteroid mining trade for 3 orders of magnitude more in value, $100,000 per pound in the case of rhodium compared to about $7 a pound for nickel. Nickel and cobalt and other metals that you would mine on the seafloor are waste material in asteroid mining. And also the volumes are ridiculously different. About 100 tons over 30 years for asteroid mining, 6 million tons per year in deep sea mining. So I don't think there's any conflict of interest there at all. So that's my opening statement.
Okay, great. Thanks both. Then let's just jump into the debate. So again, the motion for today is responsible seabed resource collection is essential to meeting the world's growing need for metals. This motion assumes responsible seabed mining. So the first question for the day is, how can we judge, how can we define whether deep sea mining is environmentally or socially responsible? What baselines or comparisons are relevant? Victor, we'll start with you. You've got 2 minutes. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And in looking at the environmental and scientific aspects of deep sea mining, I think it's important to understand what is the marginal impact of this compared to others. And I think there are a lot of false comparisons made where people look, oh, we should mine where there's less life and where there's more, like the rainforests of Indonesia. Yes, nickel is mined heavily in Indonesia in those rainforests, but it's also mined in the western deserts of Australia, in the tundra of Canada. And it's not well known, but it's certainly the case that nickel in particular is in a state of oversupply, to the state of several 100,000 tons over the last 2 years, as there's been massive investments in nickel mining over the last 5 years. And the issue there is that significant portions of production have been mothballed. So I think it's extremely important for people to understand the scale of terrestrial mining compared to what is contemplated for deep sea mining. If you look at the statistics, even at their maximum production rate, Impossible Metals will be producing less than 2% of worldwide nickel production, less than 4% of cobalt production, less than 0.2% of copper production. So when you have mines, terrestrial, that are being mothballed because of oversupply, and you bring that back online, the impact of that environmentally and scientifically is absolutely minimal. There's not this great, huge amount of destruction that would happen. Plus, I think it's also very difficult to compare the destruction of the seafloor versus the destruction on land, because we simply don't really know what is involved in the destruction of the ecosystems on the seafloor. It may be less dense life, but is volume necessarily completely correlated with importance? This is really exotic life that we don't really have on Earth. What if we end up inadvertently destroying certain biological pathways that don't even exist on land? They could have profound.
Thanks, Victor. That's 2 minutes, Oliver. The question is, how do we judge whether deep sea mining is environmentally and socially responsible? What baselines and comparisons are relevant?
Yeah, well, fundamentally, we do it through an environmental impact assessment. Deep sea mining, like all mining, is and will be highly regulated. And so it's the job of the regulator to set the rules and evaluate. And the industry has spent billions of dollars collecting environmental science and baseline data. All of that will be submitted to a regulator in the form of an environmental impact assessment. And the regulator will make a decision. And I agree with Victor on a number of points that a number of mines have closed in Australia because they can't compete with mines that operate in Indonesia. And Australia has very high ESG standards. Indonesia does not. And so the market is about supply and demand. If we can bring to bear lower cost material with lower environmental impact using new technology, we will close these land-based mines, just as what's happened today in Australia. And I think that's an absolutely win for society and planets. And what is not discussed is the technology. The technology that you use to do the mining has the biggest impact. And if we're comparing the legacy dredging and riser systems, yeah, there's big environmental impacts. But you compare a robot like the one I have over my shoulder that hovers above the seabed and only removes, say, 6% of the nodules. And if it detects any life bigger than 1 millimeter, it doesn't disturb it. Compare that impact, it's a fraction. And ultimately, it is the job of the regulator to make the decision. And this industry is inevitable. It's happening. This year alone, $500 billion is spent on the four metals, the nickel, the cobalt, the copper, and the manganese. That is forecast to grow to $1 trillion a year by 2035. This is a massive industry that needs supply.
Thanks, Oliver. Now you've each got 1 minute to respond to the points that the other have made. Victor, please go ahead.
Sure. With respect to environmental, yes, so many different environmental assessments will be done by the deep sea mining community, but in many respects, that's more like just doing crime scene analysis. They don't have the authority to stop it, or if something significant has been done to mitigate all the different damages. With respect to Indonesia, I think Oliver is now making the point that he believes that his technology will be lower cost than terrestrial mining. Technologically, that is a massively optimistic assumption, given it's one of the most harsh environments on the planet. And I think that there's this belief in the entrepreneurial community that technology can solve all problems. And I think that they will meet a very hard reality, and that when you have machines that would stop if they see 1 millimeter of life in the sediment-filled, chaotic environment of the seafloor, I think it's just a recipe for technology not coming to the rescue. And these trillion-dollar industries in mining will continue to be very cost competitive. They're not going to sit idly by, and they will continue to produce at significantly attractive prices.
Thanks, Victor. Oliver, you've got 1 minute. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm completely convinced that we will be up to 10 times less expensive than land-based mining. And the reasons to do this are to do with the fact that the grades on land just keep declining. We've already mined all of the good stuff, and the cost is directly proportional to the grade. 20, 30 years ago, we could get grades of 10% of the copper, for instance. Now the average global grade is 0.5%. We have 1% in the Caladan-Clipperton zone, plus 1.2 of nickel, plus cobalt, plus manganese. That has a massive impact. We also don't need to build infrastructure. We don't need to build roads and ports. We just reuse the ocean. And we don't have to reclaim the place. We don't have to tunnel. So absolutely will our costs be lower. I think every analyst out there that has a professional has said that deep sea mining will be lower cost. That is not in debate. And with our technology, we lower the costs even further because we have almost no people, completely automated.
Thanks, Oliver. So, Victor, I guess I want to hear you respond to Oliver's contention about the technology matters, and if they manage to only select 6% of the nodules, 8% of the nodules, does that allay your concerns?
No, I think there's a larger issue, which is the sheer number of technologies that Impossible Metals is trying to introduce. At last count, I count 14 of them. And independent assessments have said that the technological readiness level, which is a metric that the Department of Defense uses to evaluate technology, on average, it's just 3 to 4 out of 9, 9 being full commercialization.
But we're going to get to the technology a bit later. I want to stay on this question of environmental impact and if reducing the number of nodules really does address the environmental concerns.
I think in that case, the best comparison I can make is if you look at something like the metals company, they use a chainsaw to get nodules off the seafloor. And what Impossible Metals is doing is just repeatedly stabbing it. If you reduce 50% of the nodules, you're still significantly impacting the biome. And who even knows what damage and sediment that you're suffocating in terms of the microbiomes? We don't even know what the biome of the seafloor is like. It hasn't even really been studied.
Oliver, go ahead and respond to that. Yeah. And also, I'd like you to touch on the uncertainty aspect of the environmental question.
So we do know. I mean, the metals company has spent over $300 million. Collectively, the industry has spent over $1 billion collecting environmental data, sampling the DNA of the biosphere. So we absolutely do know what's down there. Can we learn more? Of course, we can learn a lot more. But we do know what's down there. And our approach in our latest blog post that we put out this week would be to remove 6% by quantity of the nodules, just 6%. And so that is a very, very tiny impact. In fact, our economics get even better. And we just move faster over the seabed floor. We still fill the robot, but we would impact just 6%. You almost would not even be able to tell that the mining had occurred. And I would ask Victor that if we can prove the economics and the technical capabilities, would you support this, where we're leaving just 6% of the nodules behind and any larger life don't disturb because the AI detects it?
Go ahead, Victor.
Yeah, I think the direct response is, I simply do not believe that you can actually harvest at the speed that you're contemplating to remove only 6% of the nodules. And even a 6% removal, I don't think there is enough information on the damage that would cause to the seafloor. But the larger point is not whether or not I would support it. I simply believe it's not relevant or necessary. Deep sea mining, in my view, is an attempt to get a very small fraction of incremental production at very high risk, technologically and environmentally, when it simply is not needed for a very small number of minerals. 77% of your revenue is going to come from nickel and manganese.
Okay, that's a good actually segue to the next topic that we're going to cover here. So moving on from responsible to the need for deep sea mining minerals. Again, our motion is responsible seabed resource collection is essential to meeting the world's growing need for metals. The next question goes to how essential the minerals from deep sea mining are. Who are they essential for? What are they essential for? And when? Oliver, it's your turn to go first. You've got 2 minutes.
Yeah, so we have four metals, and of the four, I would say nickel and copper are the most important and the most strategic. And these metals are used everywhere. So about 20% of nickel goes into batteries, 80% goes into stainless steel and other applications. Copper is used wherever there is electricity. It's used in data centers, it's used in defense. These are incredibly important markets. And if you look at the IEA, the International Energy Association, they're saying that the amount of metal that we need by 2030 is going to be about 3x where it is today and 4x by 2040. Massive demands. Everything that we do, whether it's building an AI data center, defense, infrastructure, climate mitigation, decarbonization, migration of people from the rural area to the urban area is mineral intense. And so that's why this industry will soon generate massive amounts. And the total TAM in 2035 is $1 trillion a year. Deep sea mining can supply a very large part of that. And I don't agree with Victor that we could only do a very small amount. Our plan is to be a very, very large mining company with a dozen or more concessions, all delivering to the industry, where we become one of the major suppliers of these four metals.
Okay, great. Thanks, Oliver. We can turn over to Victor. The same question. How essential are these minerals? For who, for what, and when?
I think this is, if there's one takeaway for the audience and everyone, is that deep sea mining actually plays with language. People say that deep sea mining is necessary for critical minerals, and they think there's this cornucopia of metals on the seafloor. There are only four, as Oliver admits, but even their own financials state that 77% of their value comes from just the two metals, nickel and manganese. He says copper is important, yet only a fraction of that, I think only $64 of their $700 will come from copper mining. In fact, they would produce at 6 million per year of production, they would produce only 55,000 tons of copper per year. Worldwide production is 24 million. They would produce less than 0.2%. And they're saying, oh, but we would expand from there and grow even more. Just to produce 0.2% of world copper production, they would require $2.5 billion of capital. So I think it's not really viable. And therefore, I think the real critical thing is, do you really need these metals? And the issue is that manganese, the big contributor for their revenue, in fact, it's the biggest one of all of them, is something that only produces about, I believe, about 20 million tons per year in 2023. They would produce 1.4 million at their full production rate, which would probably crash the price of the market. So the issue is, all the like rare earth metals, all these other metals, you don't get from the seafloor. These companies should be labeled as cobalt, nickel, and manganese producers on the seafloor, nothing else. And therefore, they're not really relevant and they're not really important.
Okay, great. Victor, Oliver, you'll have a minute to respond. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, copper is very much dependent on everything, and the price is forecast to grow rapidly, and so it will have a massive increase in the contribution. And so just because copper is one of the most important metals, as is nickel, and the market for this is orders of magnitude bigger in a dollar count than, say, platinum group metals. So what matters about is the cost to get the metal out. If we can get the metals out at a fraction of the cost of land, we will displace land-based mining. And that is good for the planet. It's good because they are all controlled by China. They have terrible environmental and social standards. And just as the Australian mines have closed, we will cause the high-cost producers to close. And we will take more and more of that share. And when you're talking about $1 trillion market a year by 2035, even if you're getting 3, 4, 5% of that, that's still a very, very successful business.
Go ahead, Victor, you've got a minute.
Yeah, sure. First, I do want to address something that Oliver said. He cited the IEA report for the demand for metals going forward. People should understand the IEA is not a forecasting agency. They do projections, and their projections are based on an energy transition that is now on the back end of that slope. There is less adoption for electric vehicles and others than they anticipated. So again, there should be different forecasts used that are much, much lower than what Oliver and many others in the deep sea mining community are advocating. The second is Oliver keeps coming back to saying, we're going to be low cost, we're going to be low cost, which would be in many respects great. I love low cost industries. But when he says things like, we're not even going to need infrastructure, when you're moving 6 million tons of nodules that have never been processed before, because you would need new infrastructure to process these different types of metals. You'd need rail lines to ship them from a port to a processing facility. I think so many things that Oliver unfortunately has to say are wishful thinking about the cost structure that would be in place for this brand new industry.
Thanks, Victor. Oliver, I do want you to respond to this sort of idea that the supply bottlenecks aren't necessarily at the mining stage, that there's the refining stage, the other infrastructure. So is DSM addressing the right problem?
So definitely we need new infrastructure on the processing, but we don't need new infrastructure on the transportation from the mine site to the processing venue. We reuse ships and ports. And processing is very important, but it's the two together. Processing site without feedstock is useless. A mining operation without processing is not much value, although you can stop. And so there is a lot of investment going on to figure this out. And that creates a lot of opportunities. The presidential executive order is talking about stimulating and investing. And the processing is often very tightly coupled with the mining location. For instance, Indonesia doesn't allow the processing to be anywhere else. They ban the export of the ore. And it's all owned and operated by China. So do we need investments in processing? Absolutely. Can we reuse existing nickel facilities? Yes, that's been proven. In time, we will need to invest in new processing as we build up stockpiles.
Victor, go ahead and respond to that. And I want to hear also your thoughts on the changes that might be coming down the pike in terms of a less globalized world. We are very often said we're very reliant on China, especially in nickel processing and nickel supply. And so you're skeptical to IEA forecasts about the importance of these minerals for the energy transition. But what about potential globalization kind of setbacks?
Right. Well, first, I think it's interesting. Oliver admits that there will have to be new investments in processing facilities, but anyone that knows metal processing, and I was chairman of a metal processing company for about 10 years, it's incredibly caustic and harsh. So when you talk about environmental impacts, what about those environmental impacts of all these new processing facilities for deep sea nodules? You're going to have to put them on land and they're going to have damaging impacts, and they don't exist yet. And then on your other point about Chinese dominance, the Chinese don't really care that much about the environment. And as they've shown with rare earth metals, they will do what they need to continue their domination of the supply chains. They're not going to go away. And people have shown that they will not pay more money for green materials, at least most of the world will not. And so therefore, China will have a very strong voice in terms of preserving its supply chain dominance in these metals. And they will lower price as they have done with rare earth metals, and they will have processing facilities, and they will not go gently into that night and allow some new company trying to take the share.
Yeah, Oliver, I want to hear you respond to that. There is a lot of talk about friendshoring, reshoring, but at the end of the day, isn't this just an economic question? Are people going to pay to have their critical minerals come through preferred sources?
So here I'm in agreement with Victor. I don't think they will pay a premium, and that's why we have to have a low-cost local supply. In the Caladan-Clipperton zone, just off the west coast of California, there is $18 trillion worth of critical minerals right in our backyard. 16, 17 licensed areas already. That is, the deep sea minerals represent the world's biggest source of nickel, cobalt, and manganese, much bigger than what is known on land-based reserves. And so it all comes down to costs. And I am completely convinced, as I mentioned, 4 metals in one, super high grade, relatively low cost to extract, no tunneling, no digging, no blasting, and reusing ship infrastructure and a fully automated mining fleet that we have designed and invented. Absolutely are we going to be low cost. TMC is showing that they will be low cost. We're even lower cost than them. And they're a public company that's put out a big feasibility study. So I think there's no doubt that deep sea minerals will be much lower cost than land-based.
Okay, Victor, I'm sure you want to respond to that, but It actually leads us straight into our next topic, which is the economics of deep sea mining. Focusing on the need for minerals in the question of economics and geopolitics, are the financial projections for deep sea mining realistic, and do they justify large-scale investment? Victor, it's your turn to go first. You've got 2 minutes.
Sure, I can talk about that. I wish we had talked about the technology and technical feasibility, because that is what drives the economics. And that's, I think, now the core issue of what Oliver and I are debating is the technical feasibility of their technology and whether or not it would indeed be lower cost and lower impact. And I think we just strongly disagree on that. But with respect to the economics, I think their financial projections are extremely overly optimistic. This is what I do for a living. I evaluate financial plans and businesses, and you can make numbers dance to do whatever you want on a spreadsheet. And in assumption after assumption after assumption that I've seen from Impossible Metals and the metals company, when they're looking at what assumptions that they use to produce their yield numbers, their cost numbers, their market penetration, their everything, it's very optimistic. It's not middle of the road. And for example, in their own financial models, it starts getting technical in financial analysis. They load all of their costs in a single year. Well, that wouldn't happen. It's going to take many, many years, 5, 6, 7 years to ramp up, build the technology, perfect it. And there's a cost to that time, a big cost when they're going to spend over $2.5 billion. And then it will slowly ramp up. So I think their financial projections, they're not done in a standard way at all. And they certainly are geared to be as absolutely as optimistic as possible. And where are they going to get $2.5 billion? For a commodity-based industry focused primarily with 75% of their revenue coming from manganese, which is a well-supplied market, and nickel, which has been declining in price for the last 5 years, they're not going to get debt financing. It'll have to be all equity financing. And those people don't give their money off for free. And if I see him shaking his head, where are you going to get even a reasonable amount of debt, and how much are you going to have to pay for that debt for a brand new technological industry that is unproven with commodity products? Those are death blows to people trying to raise money in venture capital. So therefore, I think it's going to be very difficult for them to actually get financing.
Thanks, Victor. So Oliver, over to you. The question is, are the financial projections for deep sea mining realistic, and do they justify large-scale investment?
Absolutely. You have $1 trillion TAM. $1 trillion is going to be spent per year on the 4 metals that we're harvesting in 2035. It's $500 billion today. Not many venture-backed businesses have such a TAM today that's growing to be so large. So that's the first thing. The second thing I would say is that our cost projections are very conservative. We've had oil and gas operated deep sea vehicles for over 30 years at similar depths, 3,000, 3,800 meters. Every single day, the same type of technology that we have in this robot is deployed in the field. And we use vast majority of off-the-shelf components. We did not reinvent the wheel. This shares 70% with any one of those ROVs or AUVs, autonomous underwater vehicles, remotely operated vehicles, that are deployed every single day in the deep ocean. So this is a very mature technology, has a quite wide supply chain that we've adopted. So we have a high degree of confidence on the economics of what we're doing. And as I said, this is such a big market that is growing so rapidly. The money will come. Now, where are we going to get the project financing to scale up? Well, the beauty of our approach is we can start with just a few robots, a couple of ships, a couple of lasers. It's much less capital than our alternatives. Equity is probably the least attractive source of raising. Debt, I agree with Victor. Debt won't work for first of its kind projects. We don't have the risk profile. But in the mining industry, you have streaming royalties, you have leasing, you have offtake financing, and you have government financing. All of those, we are well advanced, where a customer will pre-purchase the metal from us at a discount, and that's one option. The big, beautiful bill that passed Congress has $10 billion allocated for critical minerals. I think we will be in a strong position to get some of that. Streaming royalties, leasing, these are all part of the financing mix.
Thanks, Oliver. Victor, you've got a minute. Go ahead.
Yeah, I would say if you approach the financial community and say, yeah, we're going to fund all these brand new technologies into a commodity-based business, and we're going to compete with Indonesia and China on mining, I don't think you're going to get a lot of receptivity. I also think that when you compare it to oil and gas, that's another false comparison. Oil wants to come up. It's under thousands of PSI of pressure. And once you drill the hole, there's not a lot of activity. Deep sea mining is completely different. You're basically mowing the lawn at 4,000 meters, the depth of Titanic. It's a completely different technology. And when you say that all of this is proven technology, your AI recognition of nodules is not. Your 18 articulated arms hovering above the surface is not done ever before. And you're talking about putting 400 kilowatts of batteries on each of your vehicles. The most advanced submersible ever built, the one I built, had 65 kilowatts, and it still had major issues. There are a lot of technologies that you're going to have to develop. They're going to increase the risk factor for your investors.
Go ahead, Oliver.
So oil and gas, it uses large numbers of ROVs, remotely operated vehicles, and autonomous underwater vehicles, exactly the same as what we have here. So the technology in this robot is 70% common with what you see in one of those remotely operated or AUVs. And yes, we do have some unique things, the arms, but we've had these Delta-style parallel robots in factories for 30 years. We just made a version that works underwater. Our AI is pretty trivial. We control the illumination. We're looking for black rocks on a yellow seabed. And we have the lights. It's an open source library that we leveraged and trained up. We don't have to worry about sediment disturbance because the vehicle's looking ahead of itself. We don't have to be able to classify all the life, just recognize it as unique. And we've proven this tech, it works, it's done. So the reliability of our system is very well understood, and hence so is the economics.
Okay, we're going to move on to the tech question in a moment, but first I had a question from a listener earlier that I wanted to pose here, which is that given that deep sea mining for nodules is a polymetallic resource, there's 4 minerals together, I just wonder how that should be interpreted. Do we do these economic assessments for separate minerals independently, or is there something significant about the way that it's a basket of 4 together? Oliver, I'll let you start, and Victor, you can respond.
Yeah, it's in the mining industry, there's something called the all-in sustaining cost. It's basically what does it cost to do the mining, to get the material out of the ground and processed. And the average for nickel globally last year was about $15,000. Estimates, this is including both the mining and the processing, is about $1,500. And one of the reasons why the number is so low is that the all-in sustaining cost allows byproduct credits. So on a nickel basis, you add in the revenue that you would get from the copper, the cobalt, and the manganese. And so that comes off your cost. This is a standard mining mechanism that is used every day in the mining industry. And so you always have to compare all of the minerals that come out. And that's one of the big reasons why we are so low cost. The fact that we have 4 metals at orders of magnitude higher grade than we have on land, and our low transportation and mining infrastructure costs.
Yeah, thanks, Oliver. Victor, what do you say to that? Does the basket price make a difference in the economic assessment?
It does in a certain respect, and I agree with Oliver on that, of course. When you have multiple valuable metals in ore, you're going to get paid for the different metals to a greater or lesser extent. When you mine nickel, for example, you do get cobalt. I mean, these heavier elements do tend in the tectonic crust tend to coalesce. But the issue is it a dramatically higher improvement with seabed nodules than it is for terrestrial mines? It's a slight improvement, but I would not argue that it is a major one. And one thing that's completely left out is that the chemistry of the metals in polymetallic nodules is different than what you find in terrestrial mines. So the processing facilities are not geared for deep sea nodules. They will have to be rebuilt and retuned. And in some respects, they can be more difficult to process, particularly the manganese, than some of the other sources on land. But again, it comes down to relevance. We keep talking about this metal, that metal, the cost. When you're talking about being able to produce less than 1 or 2% of worldwide production, it's just not relevant.
Okay, thanks. Then we'll move on to the question that you are both most interested in talking about, which is the technical feasibility. So a common criticism of deep sea mining is that it suffers from technological optimism. So, will deep sea mining be able to contribute to our need for metals? Is robotic nodule collection technologically feasible and scalable? Oliver, it's your turn to start. Go ahead.
Yeah, what a lot of people get wrong when they analyze our cost is they compare our cost to other people's price. So when you buy an off-the-shelf AUV, autonomous underwater vehicle, you have all the margin structure. And because this industry is tens of units or hundreds of units, you can have 70, 80% gross margins. What we need, because we're using these robots for our own operation, is the actual cost of what it costs us. We don't need to load an additional margin into that. And so all the analysis that I see, they make that rudimentary, rocky mistake of basically saying, well, someone else's AUV costs $7-8 million and you're saying yours is going to be $2 million. It's because they're comparing cost versus price. That's one mistake. The second thing I would say, as I've mentioned, oil and gas and now military drones are deployed very, very widely. And they use 70% of the same technology that we have here. We buy it from the same suppliers. It's off the shelf. And so that means that there's a huge supply chain, there's reliability, they've been proven, and all we have to do is assemble and integrate them and write software. And our approach is fundamentally a parallel approach. We don't have any single points of failure. And that really helps us in the architecture that we've designed, that we have optimized it for large amount of uptime. We're not drastically affected by sea states because we do the docking of the robots below the wave affected zone. We've automated the battery swap, the maintenance, the payload unload. All of this contributes to very superior unit economics.
Thanks, Oliver. Victor, the question is robotic nodule collection technologically feasible and scalable?
With respect, I just don't buy it at all. The amount of technology that he's talking about, none of this has really been deployed in the ocean, and it is fanciful. That is the key phrase here. Is Oliver said it earlier when he was talking about some of the technology. We're doing things, but it's just underwater. There's no just when you're operating at 4,000 to 5,000 meters underwater. It's freezing cold. You're in corrosive seawater. And every single component of an underwater vehicle at that depth is under up to 5,000 pounds per square inch. I have lived this nightmare of working with a submersible at 4,000 meters. Every single dive, something broke. And they're going to be putting in 18 articulated arms, all these different things. They're going to have fleet scale AUVs, 90 per ship, organizing themselves on the bottom. Nothing like that's ever been done before. A so-called smart launch and recovery system. Just by saying it's smart doesn't mean it'll work. Having a 12 to 24 ton payload swinging on a deck, 90 of them coming on and off the ship continually, it boggles the mind how dangerous that will be. You also have other issues. For example, tell me a single large mining company that is going, wow, that's really low cost. We want to invest in that. We want to get behind that. None of them are. In fact, Glencore left the metals company because they've become convinced that this technology is not viable. No major mining company is behind this. You also have the issue of, he said there are no single points of failure. There are multiples. What if there's a major ship problem with the dynamic positioning system? Well, now all the AUVs are going to be stranded. There are so many things that are difficult to do in the ocean that they have so many areas that they could have issues. Yeah, not affected by sea state. Anyone on this call that has been on the ocean, sea state affects everything. And when you're talking about lifting 12 plus ton machines out of the sea and you're trying to put them on the deck, I guarantee you, even sea state 2 is going to cause problems.
Thanks, Victor. Okay, Oliver, go ahead.
Yeah, so I would encourage everyone to watch our latest animation. It just came out about a week ago. So we don't have anything dangling. We use a rail system to recover the robot. Sea state, of course, has an effect, but we mitigate a lot of it. And so only when you're at very kind of hurricane level strengths do we not need to worry about. We don't have dynamic positioning. We've architected our system to not require DP. on the ships. So, by using incredibly smart engineers, seasoned subsea engineers, we have well over 75 man-years of experience of building these types of systems. You can invent and mitigate a lot of the problems. And I keep coming back to this point that every single day, tens of robots get deployed into the ocean, whether they're doing marine science, they're doing oil and gas inspections, or whether they're doing military drones, and they have exactly the same technology. And you can design for the pressure, you can design for the temperature, and that's what we do. This is a solved problem. It was solved 30 years ago.
Thanks, Oliver. Okay, Victor, 1 minute for a response.
Yeah, first I'll say the technology that he's describing doesn't exist. They haven't built it. The robot behind Oliver is a Eureka 2. All of your financial projections are based on Eureka 3 and Eureka 4. The deepest depth you've ever sent, even the Eureka 2, is 1,800 meters. You've never even tested and operated any vehicle at the depths that you're going to operate. Further, you haven't even addressed basic things like the power management system on your own ship. The amount of energy that will be required to recharge your batteries is enormous. We're talking tens of megawatts that you will need on each ship to recharge these 90 AUVs on a daily basis. That's equivalent to what you have on offshore construction vessels. What you're contemplating is massive and extremely complex and incredibly power consumptive. So I think you're just grossly underestimating, waving your hands and saying, oh, we have smart people and we'll figure it out. And we're going to have magic technology solve all these problems. The sea is brutally, brutally unforgiving.
Thanks, Victor. Oliver, I'll give you a chance to just respond specifically on the power management point before we move on.
Yeah, I think we do need significant power, but that's what the ship provides. The ship doesn't have to be at sea. It can use its engines to generate the power that we need to charge the fleet, because we don't need to be transporting when we're charging the robot. So that's a pretty simple equation to calculate. Fundamentally, yes, we've only been to 1,800 meters with this one, but this vehicle is rated. You will see us in the not too distant future take this down to 6 kilometers. And, I'm a little surprised as a VC that is kind of bashing founders that want to do things that haven't been done before. That's what every single startup does, is we invent the future. And I'm really surprised that a VC investor is criticizing that a startup can build something that hasn't been built before.
Yeah, Victor, I know you've heard that question before, and I think it's worth responding to. I've been kind of impressed by your CV. You've done a lot of audacious things in your life. A lot of them involve uncertainties. A lot of them involve kind of unproven difficulties. So how should someone in Oliver's position be accounting for all of the uncertainty in this space? And more so also, Victor, I want you to talk about kind of say that this isn't likely to succeed the first try or the second try, kind of speak about what's the harm in trying. Shouldn't we be trying to move this forward, trying to get to the best possible solution? Go ahead.
Yeah, Oliver, I give millions of dollars to VCs hoping to move technology forward. The exception in this case, compared to building a factory in Ohio and trying to do something new, is you're going to be stabbing the seafloor repeatedly and damaging it. If you're wrong, you're going to be doing irreparable damage to the seafloor that I do not think needs to be done. That is the key difference in why I'm involved in this. And when it comes to risk, people also need to understand, this is what I do for a living, risk management, both in investment and when I get into extreme vehicles. Risk analysis, you have to take each part of the risk of what can fail, and they're multiplicative. If you have a chain of 10 technologies, each one 80% likely it'll work, you have to take 0.8 to the 10th power to figure out the likelihood that it will work. Risk is multiplicative, not additive. And there are so many technologies and so many uncertain factors, and what Impossible Metals and the metals company are trying to do is that I think they're forgetting that key fact. There are so many unknown unknowns when you develop new technology, and especially when you're operating in the ocean.
Yeah, Oliver, go ahead and respond on this point of risk management.
Tech innovation is inherently risky. We have de-risked over the last 5 years significant amounts, but we would not be not have the internet, we'd not have technology, we wouldn't have smartphones. We would be living in a cave if nobody took any risks. And so, I think you have to evaluate where we are, what we have built, what we have proven, and Eureka 3 is just a bigger version of this. It's almost exactly the same technology in a bigger frame. There's nothing fundamentally new there. We've proven the arms, we've proven the AI, we've proven the hover. And Victor's concern is about the environment, but this robot is hovering. It's going to impact 6%. We'll remove 6% of the nodules. You won't even be able to tell that it's happened. And we've proven that. We have the pickup all working. We've achieved our target speed at 1.7 seconds. It works. The risk is very, very low right now.
Thanks, both of you. I think we will move on to our final topic, which is decision-making and regulation. So who should decide if and when deep sea mining is allowed to proceed, and what minimum regulatory architecture must exist before commercial collection begins? Victor, it's your turn to go first. You've got 2 minutes.
Sure. I greatly respect government agencies and territorial waters and all that. So that directly answer the question, if it's in territorial waters or in the exclusive economic zone of a country, and a country decides they want to rip up their seafloor to look for nodules, that's their right. I don't like it, but they have absolutely every right to do that. When you're talking about the high seas, more than 200 nautical miles off of the coastline, now you're in international waters that the UN should have purview over. Over 150 countries have agreed the UN has purview there. So to mine the international seabed without permit from the UN and the International Seabed Authority is, in my respects, is piracy. But if you want to, get a permit from American Samoa or the continental shelf of the US and mine, more power to you. There's nothing I can do to stop it, and you have that right. But I do believe that there should be rigorous supervision and observation of deep sea mining, not just on the environmental, but on the technical and on the financial impacts, to show that there are third parties that are validating the rather extreme assumptions that many of these companies have. And I think that when that happens, if there is accurate and transparent reporting of the environmental, technical, and financial impacts, then I think that that will be very valuable to closing out this debate that it probably won't work. I think the other key part that we have to do is that understand that the seafloor, according to the UN, has that wonderful quote that it is, quote, the common heritage of mankind. 70% of the planet is ocean. It's where we get most of our oxygen from. And if we start strip mining it for economic benefits that I do not think are real, I think we put ourselves in real danger. And while, I'm a true-blooded American capitalist, I also am trying to balance that with trying to be responsible from an environmental standpoint. And I think that in this particular case, it crosses the line.
Thanks, Victor. Oliver, you've got 2 minutes. Same question. Who should decide what regulatory architecture must exist before commercial collection begins, and what should that regulatory architecture consist of?
I think I'm broadly in agreement with Victor here. We need strong environmental rules. We need a strong regulator, and we need strong enforcement. And that is the goal of the different regulators around the world, whether it's in local EEZ or whether it's in international waters. And so the goal is the regulator, not some external factors to decide if this industry progresses. And it's the goal of the contractor, the mining company, to submit a comprehensive environmental impact assessment. Typically in the international community, that's a minimum of 5 years of collecting environmental data, thousands of scientists publishing that data and presenting it with whatever technology you're using to the regulator to make an informed decision of whether the impact is acceptable. And, I reject the notion of strip mining. We are precision collecting. This is a vehicle that hovers, it uses its AI, and we can program it to take as little as 6% of the nodules and still have very favorable, in fact, the most favorable unit economics. And so at the end of the day, it is a regulator's job to make that decision. And if you're a public company, there's a lot of scrutiny with being a public company. And if you put out a pre-feasibility study that discloses your financials, it has qualified persons that sign off That is how the industry works. It's how terrestrial mining works. And I think deep sea should follow the same rules. But we need strong regulators with strong environmental laws and strong enforcement. We need the environmental impact assessment and the technology that is being used. And I am completely convinced that our tech works, and we will have by far the lowest impact, much lower than most land-based mining.
Victor, Oliver says that you two are largely in agreement. Do you agree with that?
I don't think we're in full agreement. He only talked about the environmental aspect. I would want technical and financial observers watching their tests and collecting their own data. I don't know if he's willing to do that.
Yeah,
well, he says, great. That would be great. But the other issue I would actually say is, yeah, I think you definitely need those observers and report out. And he keeps coming back to this number. They're only going to collect 6% of their nodules. But I think that this is a pattern that I've been seeing with Impossible Metals for the last few years, is that they keep changing their technology and their procedures to make it more acceptable. To do only 6% of nodule collection, to actually make money, yes, the AUVs would have to move much, much more quickly. But that's got to stress another part of the system in terms of the time cycle of the collection. Something has to give. They went from 12 arms originally on their Eureka 4 to now 18, because that lets them increase their assumption of how many nodules they're going to collect for a given amount of time. So they'll take with one hand and give with the other and make it a more outlandish assumption. And then finally, he talks about public companies. They're subject to scrutiny. Been on a public company, and you can hide a lot of information even as part of a public company.
Okay, Oliver, go ahead. Victor is saying that your technology is changing. I want to hear you respond on why you've ended up with this recent 8% number and whether it's realistic.
8%, but our technology is changing. It's still in development. We are optimizing. That's the nature. The other thing is that we will optimize the vehicle configuration per mine site. What is the exact depth? What is the abundance? What is the size distribution? This will adjust the number of arms and other things. And so, Eureka 3 Mark 1, the first version that we are now building, has a 7-arm system, but that could change depending on which specific location. Now, the most recent blog, I encourage Victor to read it. We published it, I think, on Monday, of the 6%. Basically, what happens is that if you fly over a larger area of the seabed floor, you do need to move faster, but you need less arms. Less arms means a cheaper vehicle. So the vehicle always fills its payload. We fill the payload in the same amount of time, 60 minutes, but we do it now with less arms by moving over a bigger area. So actually, the unit economics improve. Our net present value goes up, because the vehicle becomes less expensive. And it's much lower cost to move faster than have many more arms.
Thanks, Oliver. I think we've got a lot of action in the chat. I do want to get to audience questions, but quickly before we move off this regulatory topic, Oliver, how do we manage regulator access, regulator oversight in somewhere as remote as the deep ocean?
Of course, all of this has to be approved. So you can't do anything without having approval to operate. And then the regulator has the ability to have monitors on board. And of course, as a company, you have to decide how much do you make transparent. We will make everything transparent as quickly as we can. For instance, this robot has 13 cameras on it. As soon as we deploy the system in production, as it comes back onto the ship, we will offload that video data and send it via Starlink to a public repository so everybody can see the exact data in as close to real time as we can do. We will use a battery passport blockchain technology where we disclose the exact time and location where the mining happened. We will be as transparent as we can, leveraging as much new technology as possible. And we have nothing to hide. That is the goal of our company, and it's how we want to operate. That's why we've put out a lot of data. And I am completely convinced that this will have by far the lowest environmental impact of any form of mining. You imagine a vehicle that's at 6%.
Thanks, Oliver. I want to give Victor a chance to respond to any of that before we move to Q&A.
Yeah, I'll just give another example. When they want to try and solve one problem, they come another. And I'm going back at this, but this whole 6% number, et cetera. Okay, so now the AUVs are going to be moving a lot faster. So how are the arms going to perform at a faster rate? Oh, they're going to be fine. Well, they're now moving a lot faster. How will the AI interact with that? It's a different environment than it was previously. And now you're going to put more stress on the direct drive thrusters on your AUVs. What's that going to do to their maintenance? What will that do to their power load on those? Something has to give. Things in the deep ocean, and even in economics, are never free. And by the way, if you're now going to collect fewer nodules, it's going to have to be over a much, much larger area. So now instead of intensively stabbing the seafloor with your devices, you're now going to just be stabbing them in a much more broad area. But that's still that could even create more sediment and plumes on the seafloor because now you're covering a much wider expanse. You just don't know. And the amount of damage that could be done is extensive. And now you're admitting that you're going to have to go further and farther afield on the seafloor to get what you want.
Okay, Oliver, I'm sorry, I'm not going to let you respond to that. We're going to move on to audience questions. So we've got a lot of people here. Please click the hand raise icon. Holly will call on you to ask a question. Please try to respect everybody's time by keeping your questions brief. And please also only ask questions that you actually want to know the answers to. Veiled statements in the form of a question are just not going to contribute to today's debate. So Holly, I hope that you've got some questions lined up.
Yeah. We have one from Jose. And let's see, it looks like Jose, you have your mic on. So please ask your question.
Yeah, thanks. My name is Jose Benchitreat. I am with Natural Resources Canada, a member of the Canadian delegation to the ISA. Thanks for the debate. Super interesting. Quick question, interest of time. On the investment financing side, Victor, a lot of discussion there. I just would like you maybe to elaborate a little bit more on how we factor in the new reality of greater consideration being given by governments to security of supply in the discussion on the supply demand of these critical minerals, because this is obviously a much bigger piece of the discussion, especially in the past year. So I'd like you to elaborate more how you factor in that securing supply in the broader discussion of supply demand for these commodities. Thanks.
Yeah, I'll just say it's about context. Again, the nature of your question is critical minerals, right? There are like 60 according to the Department of Defense. Deep sea mining only addresses 4 at most, and 3/4 of the value of impossible metals comes from 2.
I'm talking about the 4. So ones aside, I'm talking about those ones.
Fine. Okay. So copper, again, they would produce less than 0.2% of world production. You're not going to solve the issue with deep sea mining. It's not where you get the ore that matters. What matters is the processing. Nickel and cobalt, those are relatively small. Again, they don't address the majority of the production. And China owns the processing capability of all those metals. How are you going to break that? China's not just going to walk away from that. You can't put it in the US. It's too environmentally damaging and it's too expensive. Where is Oliver going to be processing his nickel? Indonesia? Well, the Chinese own the Indonesian processing mines. So the major issue there is breaking the supply chains would require massive investments in processing facilities in the West. And China is not just going to give that up. They've shown repeatedly they will drop price. They will do what they have to preserve their supply chain dominance.
Thanks, Victor. Oliver, do you have any comments on how you're going to, or how anyone is going to implement this security of supply in a realistic manner?
Yeah, I mean, on the processing side, I think Canada has a lot of expertise in mineral processing, and that can be leveraged here. And the West collectively is willing to make those investments because right now China has a 25-year lead. It's strategically very, very worrying. The likelihood of a hot war with China because we run out of everything in weeks is real. And Western governments know this. And so the investments are going to come. And nodules are the planet's biggest source of 3 of these critical metals, nickel, cobalt, and manganese. They also have large amounts of copper. And I hear Victor saying 0.2%, 1%. But when you're talking about a massive number, $1 trillion, that's still a huge business. And it still moves the needle for the country. The US today, about 55% of its copper is imported, and 100% of nickel, cobalt, and manganese is imported in the US, in North America. That's a huge problem. And so anything that moves that needle is really, really strategic. And I agree with Jose. Strategic value of these metals is immense, and that's why this industry is inevitable. It is starting. China is the biggest investor. The US is there, as are others.
Thanks, Bo. Thanks, Jose, for the question. Holly, let's move on to the next questioner.
Excuse me, Andrew?
Yes, hello. Andrew Thaler. I'm a deep sea ecologist. I want to thank you both for a very interesting discussion. This has been incredibly informative, and I think we've all learned a lot here today. One thing I haven't heard mentioned is the effect of noise on the marine environment. So with these Eureka system at scale, we're talking about potentially the largest and densest deployment of AUVs on the seafloor that we've ever seen. The volume of one of these ROVs, AUVs, as it's operating, and what steps is IM doing to mitigate the effects on the ocean soundscape? Because when you have large-scale continuous noise, that can have very profound impacts on siniferous species that are migrating through the area and that need sound to navigate and to find partners and to communicate.
Yeah, let me answer that. Thank you, Andrew, for the question. I just saw your paper that you put out on this area, which is very informative. So I think the first thing to say is that the large marine mammals that are the largest impacted by noise will be at the surface or close to the surface. They're not going to be at 6,000 meters. And we have optimized our system to completely minimize our noise footprint compared to the alternatives. So we're not using dynamic positioning on our ships. That's a massive source of noise. We don't have a riser system with pumps, which also has a lot of noise. And we are designing our LARS system and our smart hook to minimize its noise footprint. And so we actually think that the noise footprint from our system will be significantly less than the alternatives, and it will also be greatly reduced at the surface or near surface where there is the biggest impacts. Of course, we will have to do scientific studies, we will have to do testing, we're committed to doing that, we'll have monitoring, and that will all go into the environmental impact statement, where we will describe precisely what the noise footprint is and what mitigation strategies we are using.
Thanks, Oliver. Victor, is it okay if we move on to the next question?
Yeah, I'll just say that I actually don't disagree with Oliver. I think that the acoustic environment is going to be, in some respects, not significantly impacted, especially by the nature of their technology compared to the, let's just call them the alternative.
Thanks. Okay, go ahead, Holly.
All right, Jack?
Hi there. My name is Jack Payette. I've studied geobiology at MIT, and I'm working in ocean conservation. I have a specific science question for impossible metals, and it's regarding your FAQ on your website. It appears that you're disputing some part of the peer-reviewed research on the Clarion-Clipperton Zone natural sedimentation rates. This is from a paper, Voles et al. 2018. And you guys are citing benthic storms as models, benthic storm models as an example of really strong currents like the Gulf Stream in the Atlantic that could affect places like the CCZ and American Samoa where you plan to mine. But this really doesn't seem like the appropriate point or research to cite. And why do you get this wrong, or sort of how can we understand that your FAQs are really following the science to the T?
So there is scientific data that talks about benthic storms. There's also seismic activity, which it happens and will have. And so we were rebuffing a statement that we would have many thousand times more natural sediment, because that ignored these natural phenomena that do occur on the deep sea.
I guess, yeah, to counter that, I've read the paper by Sean Chen and actually studied with him. I don't really think that applies as well to the CCZ. It's really about EKE energy passed from really big stuff like the Gulf Stream or the Kyosho current down to the deep sea. So I'm just sort of picking on that particular point about what actually is going on down there. Yeah, and again, seismic thing is a totally different ball game, right? But I think, yeah, your FAQ is a little bit off on that particular point.
Can you, sorry, Oliver, can you just also speak? Jack raised the question of trust in your FAQs. I think it's just worth responding also to that. When you get something wrong, how do you repair that?
Absolutely. If we get something wrong, we'll update it. But the information that we have and that we cite is that benthic storms exist on the ocean, seismic activity exists in the ocean, and will provide natural sedimentation. And so the analysis that was done that says that our impact will be so many thousand times larger, ignored these natural phenomena. That is the point that we made in the FAQ, and we stand behind that. But the reality is that this is a hovering vehicle that will release some sediment as it picks. What we have today is completely unoptimized. It will probably be substantially less by the time we get to production.
Thanks for the question. Jack, Victor, do you have anything on this before we move on?
No, I'm not a scientist.
Great. Holly, next question, please.
All right, Bobby Joe.
Hi, thank you all for this. Oliver, I have a question for you. I'm just wondering, to date, the testing you've done, have you been using an insurer for it? And then when you're proposing work off American Samoa, who have you been dealing with? What are you proposing to insure the operations? And tell us more about like the bonding with the US government and how we're going to be sure that this won't fall on taxpayers.
Yeah, the vessel was insured. The vehicles were not. We chose not to insure the vehicles ourselves, but the vessel is insured, as is normal policy. But I'd ask you, what impacts do you think? I mean, we would have a financial loss if we lost one of these vehicles, but there isn't going to be any environmental impact, right? It's like, as I said, every day, hundreds of these types of robots get deployed in the ocean every day.
Well, I'll put back my original question, which was, what is your plan to bond? So if you're not worried about impacts, obviously you could probably negotiate a lower bond with the government. I'm also not a scientist, as Victor said, but I'm quite concerned about impacts to fisheries, impacts to cultural sites, which I know you haven't mapped unless you've done so very recently. But leaving aside that, which I feel like is something we could really get into, I just want to know specifically, what's your proposal for bonding?
Yeah, we will do what the regulator requires. So we will follow the law, and whatever the regulator requires is what we will do. When it comes to cultural significance, like a shipwreck or something, the vehicle has forward detection sonar. So we're not going to impact anything. As I said, the impact is very similar to the hundreds of AUVs that are probably deployed today in the ocean, whether that's a military, oil and gas, or scientific use.
Okay. Thanks, Bobby Joe. Holly, have we got more? Thank you.
Simon.
Thank you so much, and thank you for organizing this. Simon Holmström from Seas at Risk European NGO. I will have the pleasure of debating with Oliver in 2 weeks, but I couldn't resist of asking this question to you, Oliver, already now. On the software specifically, am I correct in understanding that the software, there's only one person in charge of the algorithm of the nodule picking, the arm? And will Impossible Metals be able to make those algorithms publicly available so that researchers and experts can validate or falsify the claims made there? I think it has been asked in one of your webinars before, and it has been said that that would be possible potentially, but that somebody would look into it. So I'd like to know that.
Yeah. So we use open source software. We use an open source project called YOLO, You Only Look Once. It's very common computer vision algorithm that we use. We have tuned it for what we do. Let me go and talk to the team and see what the implications would be of releasing that. I imagine we might be able to release it on a known commercial use. We wouldn't want someone to compete with us, but I agree. I think it was good. I want to be clear, the software does not classify. It just detects nodules and seabed, and anything else it just assumes as life. So we do not have to have seen the particular form of life. In fact, in our lab, we often put screwdrivers and other equipment in our test tank to just test the algorithm. So, but let me take that as an action. Maybe, Holly, you can remind me, and we will talk about if we could release it for non-commercial use.
Thanks, Simon. Thanks, Oliver. Holly, have we got more questions?
We do not have anybody else with their hand raised at this point. Oh, we do have Jack who's back. Jack, your mic's on. There you go.
Yeah, thank you. I just have one more quick question, and this, I guess, could be to everyone. I'm wondering if anyone has looked at the alpha particle and the radionuclide risk, not necessarily to humans, but specifically to the deep sea ecosystem and an impact to life on the seafloor.
So I can start. There was a very recent BGR paper published that really shows that the risk to humans is incredibly low. It's less than the radiation than probably this bottle of water that is emitting right now. And so I would encourage the scientists to read that paper and show it shows that the radiation that comes out is incredibly low.
Yeah, I would just add, yeah, alpha particles, I would agree with Oliver. I mean, you can stop alpha particles with a piece of paper. I think one thing that hasn't been disclosed, though, is, and I know it's a controversial topic, which is that of dark oxygen, where there could be oxygen generation on the seafloor. I am not convinced that it's happening either, but it's possible. But the issue is, I'm curious, what if it's actually validated? And there's even a minute amount of oxygen being produced on the seafloor. What will the DSM community do about that? Because that's where we get most of our oxygen, is from the ocean. And so in that respect, that just shows one more potential vulnerability that would make it hard to fund. I mean, you don't want these catastrophic events that are hanging over an industry, like the validation of dark oxygen coming out, that could actually shut them down. I mean, there are a lot of things that are unknown that are of high risk. Alpha radiation, I do not think is one of them, but there are others.
So let me counter that. I mean, I think the science is inconclusive on dark oxygen right now. There's some papers that say yes, there's some that say not. There's more work being done. Let's for the sake of this discussion, assume it is proven. I'm skeptical where the energy comes from to split water into hydrogen and oxygen. That could be a bigger discovery than anything else if that was true, but let's assume. First of all, the amount of oxygen released would not make a difference on a planetary scale, right? Compared to rainforests and algae that are at higher levels, it's a rounding error. So it's not going to have an impact, but it could have an impact to the local environment, for sure. And so this is where selective collection makes sense. We can program the vehicle, and we're now proposing maybe for the first deployments to support the precautionary approach, that we would only take 6% of the nodules. And that would allow people to study and see. And we think that because of the precautionary approach, because our technology selectively collects, it would absolutely allow the habitat to maintain viability, including if oxygen was being generated.
Thanks for that. We've got one more question from Dan. I've found where to see the question list. So Dan, we'll take you, and then we're going to move on to, I think, closing remarks from Victor and Oliver.
Okay, yes, thank you very much for this. And I appreciate this, just kind of a very, very high level of technical and investor expertise. But I'm speaking as someone from American Samoa. My question is, how do you propose to reconcile the gap between what scientists and investors believe is feasible and what Pacific communities like CNMI or American Samoa or Hawaii consider acceptable or safe?
So let me have a go at that. I think we are many years away from commercial mining being permitted in American Samoa. And so the goal between now and then is to collect the scientific data, understand the environmental impact, and submit that as an environmental impact assessment to the regulator to make a decision. So that is work that has to happen over the next 3 to 5 years before we would actually get to go commercial mining. Now, there is an additional complexity that right now there is no mandatory requirement to share revenues from waters of American Samoa with the community of American Samoa. This is done for oil and gas, and it's being proposed to be done for offshore wind, but it has not yet been proposed for critical minerals. We wrote a blog post. We would encourage Congress to make that change. We think it is important that any lease or royalty fees that a mining operation pays to the federal government is shared with the community of American Samoa. But that requires Congress to act.
Yeah, I believe we have democratic institutions, including in American Samoa, and so it really comes down to the local representatives and structures to actually preserve the indigenous people's rights. I would like nothing more than for any country that's contemplating deep sea mining to, before they allow for commercial exploitation in their territorial waters or EEZ, that there just simply be a referendum, an up or down vote, yes or no. And I think it's their right because it's their territory. And I think that would help settle the issue. And if we don't, and if you don't, then we're not really living in a democracy.
I would counter that we have a Senate that is our people's representatives to make these decisions. Why would this decision go to a referendum versus other decisions? That's the whole point of having a representative democracy.
I would say because it's a relatively unusual situation, and when you're talking about a massive area that is usually larger in area than the territory itself that the people live on, I think it's an exceptional circumstance that, as many referendums address, that this would be one that is worthy of a referendum, as it is in many other situations. That's just my view.
Well, thank you for your time.
Thanks. I see that they've just turned the lights off in my building as Norwegians go home before 6:30, apparently.
You're an energy superpower.
Scott, if you make your question quick, I think we can squeeze it in while I go turn the lights on.
Thanks so much, Eric. Thanks to both of you for this discussion. It's been really enlightening. I was hoping to just return briefly to the national security question. Victor, as you both mentioned, China has this sort of iron grip on the supply chain around cobalt and nickel, especially. I think my fear is around kind of a wag the dog situation wherein China has significant national security leverage over the United States because of sources of nickel. Victor, I think my question to you is, what is the alternative, right? Like, how do we break China's control on the supply chain for those minerals in particular, which go into cell phone batteries, without doing this? I'm open to better alternatives, but curious if you have preferences or ideas on that.
Yeah, I think it's a canard, the whole national security angle tied to deep sea mining. No one talked about this 4 years ago when deep sea mining started getting really popular. And you have to break apart the rocks, the ore with the metals in them, and the processing. To answer your question, the way you break China's hold on nickel and cobalt in particular is you work with our allies, Australia, Canada, as Oliver mentioned, even Ukraine, and you have to make the investment in the processing facilities. That's the real key, not where you get the rocks. If you throw enough money at this problem, you can mine enough ore of cobalt and nickel and process in the United States, and absolutely you would break China's supply dominance on that. But the issue is everybody runs to, we need to get the actual ore from the ocean. And I just think that that's completely fallacious and that it's a canard. People are really trumpeting the whole China, China, China angle to support deep sea mining when that's not really the issue, where you get these two particular metals. You can get them from other countries that are close allies terrestrially, certainly in the volumes that we need to supply our own needs in the United States, and you do not have to go into the ocean to get them.
So let me counter. We've seen the example of nearly all the nickel mines in Australia close because they can't compete with Chinese operating mines in Indonesia. We cannot get them from allies, the feedstock, because it's not cost competitive. And so building a processing plant without any feedstock is completely useless. You have to consider the two together. You need mining and you need processing. And if you only have one part of that equation, China will control the situation. And most mining geographies now are not allowing exporting of the ore. It adds more cost and it's a national security issue. Indonesia banned export of ore. So if we purely invest in the mineral processing side and don't put on the feedstock, we will not solve this problem. We have to do both together. And that's why stockpiling is such a powerful strategy, because we can stockpile the nodules in the US in an ideal location to build the processing plant. But we need to invest in both, not just one.
Yeah, real quick, I would just say, the key fundamental difference between Oliver and I is that he keeps insisting that impossible metals will be the low-cost source, and I disagree. And if he's wrong, then Australia and Canada would be the way that you get the metal.
But Australia and Canada have closed already because of Indonesia. That's already happened.
They haven't closed their entire nickel and cobalt processing facilities. They still mine. The issue is it's much lower. They have not completely shut down all their production.
Australia has basically closed all of their nickel mine. They have almost.
Okay. I'm gonna stop this discussion. Rory and Andy, I see that you've got questions, but I know both of you are very involved in this discussion, so I'm sure there'll be other opportunities for you to get those questions out. Thanks everyone for the questions. I see there's been a lot of activity in the chat. I think that's great. And it's time for closing statements. Oliver and Victor, you've each got 2 minutes to summarize your positions on today's motion, which I'll remind you is responsible seabed resource collection is essential to meeting the world's growing need for metals. Oliver, I think you're up first at this point. You've got 2 minutes. Go ahead.
Okay. So I appreciate the debate. I think there's been some interesting discussions. Where I fundamentally disagree is that we absolutely need these metals. It's, as I said, it's $1 trillion market in 2035. It's $500 billion market today. That is a huge market that will create massive returns, but it's all based on the economics of the ore. Polymetallic nodule has 4 metals. That's very unusual on land-based. It has super high grades, sometimes up to 10 times higher. And we don't need to build any infrastructure to access the mine. We reuse the ships and the ports. If you think of a new mine in, say, Africa or Indonesia, you have to build that infrastructure, build the road, build the power, build the accommodation. So I am completely convinced that with our new technology, we will drastically lower the cost. And that will allow us to wrestle control away from China. Does it need investment? Absolutely. But there is $18 trillion worth of metals off the West Coast that we can access in the Caladan-Clipperton zone. We can do this at a much lower cost. And this is how we wrestle control away from China that has spent the last 20. The economics are fundamental. If we had a massive new resource, but it was at the high cost, it doesn't matter because China will dump, they will subsidize, they will provide zero cost of capital, and we will not compete. If we have a resource that is 10 times less expensive, we are isolated from that Chinese manipulation. And then what never gets really discussed is the environment
10 seconds, Oliver.
And technology. So fundamentally, new technology changes the impact. And that's what we've delivered and have now proven, leveraging off-the-shelf oil and gas technologies.
Thanks very much, Oliver. Victor, your last word against the motion. Responsible seabed resource collection is essential to meeting the world's growing need for metals. Go ahead.
Yeah, I always applaud entrepreneurs trying to move technology forward, and I applaud Oliver for his ambitions. But again, I think that it simply isn't going to work and that the environmental damage is not worth even the attempt. He talks about trillions and trillions of dollars of potential mining. By far, most of that is dominated by copper. And polymetallic nodules only have 1% content of copper. Nickel and cobalt are relatively smaller elements of that multi-trillion-dollar mining complex. The days of DSM being really popular were in the early 2020s when prices spiked. And it was driven by electric vehicle battery manufacture, where you needed cobalt and nickel for those batteries. Technology has changed dramatically. You now have lithium iron phosphate batteries, you have sodium ion batteries. That's why the prices of these metals, cobalt and nickel in particular, have been coming down for the past 4 years. There's that. The technology that Oliver keeps coming back to of saying it'll be 10 times less expensive than terrestrial mining. If you believe that, good luck to you. There are very few industries in history where someone has come up with a 90% cost reduction in the basic material processing capability. His technology is unbuilt, it's untested, and it's unfunded. That's a Eureka 2, not a Eureka 3 or Eureka 4. And just making something bigger actually makes it more complicated and more prone to failure. These volumes that deep sea mining will produce are a drop in the bucket. And again, it's only a very small handful of minerals that you're actually talking about. So therefore, I think in large part, if you want to do a pilot project in territorial waters approved by a government, go for it. Get your investors' money. I can't stop you. But I think with transparency, it'll show very quickly that the technology and the economics are not near what you thought they were. And that over time, the cost competitiveness of your technology is not going to improve, but the prices of the metals are going to keep going down as they are replaced with cheaper and better alternatives, making DSM more and more irrelevant over time. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, I guess that's a wrap. Thanks, both Oliver and Victor, for keeping this discussion polite and constructive and substantive. Thanks also to the audience for joining and for such great questions.